In an earlier video, I explained why indifference curves can't cross, and the reasoning was that it causes a contradiction with the logic of the notion of indifference. But a viewer had a pretty reasonable question that I wanted to address here, so let's take a look. So here's the basic outline of the argument. Note here that I have an indifference curve 1 that's at a utility level of 8, and then showed that points A and B were both on indifference curve 1, so they both gave a utility of 8. And then I introduced this crossing indifference curve 2, that also had point A on it, and made the argument that then if we introduce a third point C, since we're indifferent between A and C and also indifferent between A and B, that given what we know of indifference, we should also be indifferent between B and C. And I said that that created a contradiction because B and C were on different indifference curves. The point that the viewer made was, is this really a contradiction, or could we resolve this by just saying, well, maybe the consumer is then indifferent between indifference curves themselves, meaning that they're indifferent between indifference curve 1 and indifference curve 2, or put another way, maybe it's possible that indifference curve 1 and indifference curve 2 both represent a utility level of, in this case, 8. So let's talk about that and think about why, even though that seems intuitively plausible, that in itself also doesn't make logical sense. The reasoning for why different indifference curves have to represent different levels of utility, or put another way, why consumers can't be indifferent between indifference curves, is actually pretty simple. One of the assumptions that we make, in this particular case at least, is that both goods confer positive marginal utility, or both goods are in fact goods rather than bads. And if the consumer actually likes both of the goods, then it has to be the case that situations where the consumer has more of both goods have to make the consumer better off. And we can see in this case, if we look down here, I'll just draw an arrow up and to the right a couple times here, we see that in this region, indifference curve 2 provides more of both of the goods, so by definition, indifference curve 2 would have to confer higher utility. We could also look at the region up and to the left and see in this case, indifference curve 1 provides more of both of the goods than indifference curve 2. And so in that region, indifference curve 1 would have to represent a higher level of utility than indifference curve 2. In any case, both of these situations illustrate the fact that this possibility where maybe the consumer is just indifferent between indifference curve 1 and indifference curve 2, which if true would resolve the contradiction that we see here, isn't something that is actually logically feasible. And so it is unambiguously the case that sensical indifference curves can't actually cross.